as we find it. I wish to see it as it is, perhaps, and ask some questions of it. And as with our second speaker, I stand in a certain awe of the facts of history. The facts are by themselves magic. And there is tremendous depth and a kind of reverence for things that are real. Things as we find them are powerful and instructive to the human consciousness, and they represent part of a progression of human consciousness forward. I'm fascinated by all of these things, and I just wanted to say at the outset here that, I'm kind of a frugal guy. I just want to establish a couple of things here. I'm a frugal guy, and so the other day, I went for some acupuncture, and it was much cheaper. Thank you. And also for the benefit of the needy yoder, I just wanted her to know that I am starting a choral group that is going to be staffed and composed of completely comprised of no one but lawyers. And I'm going to be the leader, and it's going to be called Attorneys at Law. And so actually, I'm just trying to establish that my talk is possibly going to be better than some of these things. When my dad passed away, because that's always funny, right? So we went about the business of having a gravestone made, and I was telling a friend of mine about this just the other day, because that's funny too, right? And I was telling him, well, I helped design this gravestone, and it was taken forever. And this is actually true. This actually did happen. This is the real story, because the facts themselves are magic. And I was telling my friend about this, and I said, well, my dad's gravestone was just taking forever. So I called up the company in Vermont, the Ranelli brothers, who were actually manufacturing the gravestone, and they said, actually, yes, it is taking longer because there's another one that's actually, we have to finish before we can work on your dad's. And you'll get a kick out of this. It's actually Mary Tyler Moore's gravestone. And I was telling a friend of this thing, and so this friend of mine said, oh, so she didn't make it after all. Anyway, okay, so, the final thing I want you to consider is that if you perform just a very small shift, kind of a dramatic shift in that sea shanty, what do we do with a drunken sailor? To what did I do with a drunken sailor? That takes on a whole other meaning, because you've probably heard of a sea shanty. That's a Plan B shanty. All right. Anyway, on to the Trinity site. In about February of 1995, I had an unused copy of Richard Rhodes' book, The Making of the Atomic Bomb, sitting around the house. I had purchased it in 1988 from a friend's bookstore, Don Martin of Vermont, at a bookstore over in Lenexa, and I went to see Richard Rhodes there, and he signed a copy for me. And curiously enough, he had actually married a friend of mine. I could actually call him up and talk to him. And I had a copy of his book, The Making of the Atomic Bomb, and I read something in an article that the Japanese had an atomic program as well. And I hadn't realized that, so I got into the book and I started reading the book about a third of the way in. I eventually finished reading from that point and then went back to the beginning. And round about April of that year, 1995, I was reading, and I realized that the date of the test was July 16th, 1945. And I realized, wait a minute, this is going to be 50 years. And at that moment, I looked at him and said, I'm going. I gotta see this. I gotta see what this is. I want to be in that place at that moment. I don't care if anyone else shows up. I'm going to stand at the gate and look at it. As it turned out, lots of people were going there too, and the site was open. And I had a kind of a magical trip going there, a magical road trip going there. I got prepared for this trip. I collected water. I imagined all of the possible scenario that it would involve, being stuck in the desert. And I brought extra water, which figured into things, and brought extra antifreeze, which turned out to be a wonderful alpha emitter moderator, it turned out. And I'll get to that. But I just really committed to going on this trip. Now, I'm going to need to probably mention a few things that are kind of technical here, having to do with atoms. And let's just say that the atoms that we are made out of are fairly stable. But when atoms get to be very, very large, very heavy, up above lead, they start to become rather fragile. They start to become like a kind of a jiggly bowl of jello that is kind of getting to fall apart. And that is how atoms become able to split. And when some atoms split, they split in a way that they spit out a couple of extra neutrons, which are the heavy part, and those go and they hit other atoms and those split. And that's really how a nuclear chain reaction works. And so that's what the whole story of the making of the atomic bomb was about. And I have to say Richard Rhodes is a very good science explainer. I recommend the book, and I recommend the sequel to the book called Dark Sun, which was the making of the hydrogen bomb. And yes, this talk is in the light of the recent 2 movies that have been popular in the theater. So, and something about this story does actually relate to that. So I headed forth on this trip with some knowledge gleaned from the book of the history of the physics, the history of the cultural attitudes that led us as a nation to be able to use such a device. And I get it that these things were very serious. I was watching a video today on the results of the device used in Japan, of course. And I take that pretty seriously. But at this point in the life or the reality of the story, the bomb was weirdly innocent for those few moments. It hadn't done that thing yet. And that's what I'm really fascinated about as a kind of a moment before the commitment of the device to this actual history. And so I embarked on this trip in July of 1995 because the test was July 16th, 1945 at 5 o'clock, 29 minutes and 45 seconds in the morning. There's a wonderful explanation in that book of different mechanisms that had to fall into place in order for that to happen, in order for the reactions to be initiated. It was just amazing. For a moment, for a few moments, the container that held the nuclear reaction that was creating and destroying almost all the elements in the periodic table, that container was made just of light. It's an absolutely amazing thing outside the human scale to imagine what this power and the circumstances of these physics that were relatively new at the time. A lot of very new things were going on at that point in history. There are materials that had never been machined before. I have a friend here in Lawrence whose father worked on the Manhattan Project, And nobody had ever machined graphite much. And this friend of mine has a gigantic graphite nut and bolt that his father made while working on the Manhattan Project. They had to figure out how to calculate the relief angles of the tooling. Nobody had machined plutonium. Nobody had machined different isotopes of uranium. They had properties. They had all the properties you would have associated with magnetism and chemical reactivity and all these things. They were determining what they were. Some of these materials had never existed prior to this. So it was just an amazing amount of new technology and new practical things having to be created, literally created. So I headed off to New Mexico under a kind of right sense of discovery. And along the way, I saw a sign for the UFO crash landing site, so I stopped there in Roswell. And I picked up a stone at the site, which was actually closed. I picked up a stone and declared it puzzling evidence and headed forward. But I discovered in Roswell town itself a very interesting thing in the city museum, which had art and a display of space hardware, and Robert Goddard's entire workshop. Folks, Robert Goddard moved from Worcester, Massachusetts, everything out to Roswell, New Mexico. So Roswell was kind of already primed for aerial phenomena, just saying. But they still make a lot of money from the whole UFO crash thing. I'm just saying. People were hearing about rockets because of Robert Goddard. I didn't know that. And Robert Goddard was working with a shop just really similar to my own, which was his ideas. Anyway, so I eventually arrived at the White Sands Missile Range, which is where the Trinity Center is, and waiting outside, talking to people, waiting for the gates to open. And I talked to some people who, a woman who was at that point in the 90s probably looked up here to be maybe in her 50s or 60s. And she had been a kid during the Manhattan Project and used to sit on the knee of Robert Oppenheimer. And just to talk to people who had known the people. And I had a kind of a rule throughout the day. Any old guy in a bolo tie probably worked on the bomb. And it kept working. I kept finding people like that. And when I eventually got into the walking up the road to the gate of the Trinity site, is there a picture? Wasn't there a picture perhaps of that day? Yeah, I just I shot video that day, but unfortunately the tape got tangled up in the camera, and I haven't been able to get it out. And is this? Yeah, there we are. Here we are. Yeah, that's me on that day with one of the spare casings from the Fat Man device. And that's a very ill-advised beard. And that's the camera. I'm holding the camera that has the tape cut inside it. So that's really all I got here. So thanks for bearing with me. But I spent some time walking around the site, but it all kind of kicked off at 5:29 and 45 seconds on that morning, when I, earlier on that morning, a few minutes, about an hour prior to that, had given a bottle of water from my provisions to the only other guy there in an Amish hat. And it turns out that the reason that he was wearing an Amish hat was because he was an actual Mennonite. And me, I'm all hat and no Amish. And so he used the water that I gave him to mix up some dry timber paint in the color of red, and at 5:29 and 45 seconds, he threw it on the obelisk, for obvious reasons. and like blood. And at that moment, 50 years to that moment, there were several crews of camera people from different media outlets, and there were several from Japan there. And at that moment, there was this sudden scrum, this scuffle, and there were people punching and kicking, and Japanese cameramen were fighting to get a picture of that. I thought this is so incredibly strange. And I spent, as the sun came, and that was before sunrise, and so there was actual footage of this. I know that CBS Sunday Morning was there that day, so there is a video, a live video of what happened there that day. And so I spent just time just walking around, talking to random people. And there were a lot of people there who, like myself, were kind of slightly snot-nosed art students who were trying to find something and understand something and maybe experience something grand, but at the same time something ironic. And because all of those things do exist side by side. And there were various ones going around. You see them kind of crouched down and like this, and they'd be looking for something. And they were picking up pieces of Trinitite. Trinitite is the glass that the surface of the desert melted into when the device worked. And the surface temperature became in excess of 3,000 degrees. And the Trinitite is green. The White Sands missile range is called White Sands because the sand is white. And white sand will turn into clear glass. But because of the steel tower that the device was perched in to allow the development of the reaction sphere, that tower was consumed and turned into gas and mixed with the other daughter products of the reactions and turned the glass into that kind of green window glass. So, like a Coke bottle is an example of glass with iron in it. That was the kind of scale and temperature outside of human experience. We had never seen these kind of things before. And the military eventually scraped up pretty much all of the Trinitite and buried it in an undisclosed location. And there's still a small place where you can go and look at the original condition of the Trinity site. They have some lids you can lift and look inside. But throughout the day, I kept noticing different artifacts around at the Trinity site. And one was this strange steel cylinder. And I knew about this from reading the book, but I had never heard of this prior to that. They were considering that the plutonium was rather expensive to make. It cost about $2 billion, if I'm correct, in 1945 dollars to make the small amount of plutonium that they had, and they didn't want to waste it. So they created a huge steel bottle that they called Jumbo, and they brought it out to the site, and they were about to use it. But then things started to look pretty promising in the calculation of the reaction sphere. And they had a supercomputer of sorts. And it was a room full of what were called Marchand calculators. That were mechanical calculators for calculating logarithms. And they had different non-technical people from essentially the wives of some of the scientists and some of the people working on the Manhattan Project, sitting in this room, cranking the calculators numbers of times, and the different mathematicians like Leo Szilard and Hans Bethe and others, a lot of the mathematicians from one neighborhood in Hungary who never knew each other, they would walk around through the calculators and see what was developing in terms of the probabilities, and they realized that at this amount of critical, slightly subcritical mass, that it was going to work. They realized. So they decided not to use Jumbo, and they set Jumbo up on a kind of a steel hanger frame within some proximity to the explosion. And it survived. But what does that relate to? Well, while I was there, I noticed a guy talking to a group of people, and I made a video of him. His name turned out to be Keaton Keller. And Keaton Keller, like a lot of scientists working on the Manhattan Project, had a specialty. He was a metallurgist. And he was a young guy. He was probably in his early 20s, like a lot of the scientists were. So this was really almost a kind of a children's crusade in a lot of ways. A lot of the people working on the Manhattan Project were still adolescents. But they were very, very bright adolescents. And, before the age of 25. And Keaton Keller's job was going to be, after the bomb was put in jumbo, and if it didn't work, his job was going to be lowered down inside of jumbo to scrape the plutonium off the inside of the bottle. And so that was going to, luckily he didn't have to do that, but he was describing how to do that. Now you can find Keaton Keller on the Nuclear Heritage Archive. I found his name today, and you can read about him and his career. And then later in the morning, I went out to, a few miles away, I took a bus, a few miles out from the Trinity site, and I went to a place called the McDonald Ranch House, and that's where they actually assembled the bomb. That's where you see that little iron fence, kind of little crane over the gate. They had a place where they could hook a pulley. And because they assembled a lot of heavy things there, and they had built a bunch of workbenches inside the McDonald Ranch House. Of course, the McDonald family had been moved out. There was still a stock tank there full of water, and a lot of the scientists went swimming in that stock tank that day, which and while I was there at the McDonald Ranch, and by the way, the workbenches all still look brand new because there's low humidity, they keep the shades down all the time, and it's fairly high in elevation, so things kind of last pretty well there. Our cars just don't rust up in those parts of the country, or they don't rust as much. So while I was there at the McDonald Ranch House, I saw this older guy with a bolo tie and a cowboy hat, and he was standing there with his wife, and I spoke to him, and I said, "By any chance, sir, did you work on the bomb?" He said, "Well, yes, as a matter of fact, I did." And I said, "Really? Tell me about it." And it turns out his last name was Wilkening, and I found him on that nuclear heritage site. His name was Marvin Wilkening, and he was there with his wife, and he had worked directly with Enrico Fermi on the Chicago pod, the place where they got a moderated nuclear reaction to take place. Remember, what they were doing at the Trinity site was creating a chain reaction that would go out of control really fast, or let's say become very large in a controlled way that then became KKI really fast. And what they were trying to do with Chicago, with the project there, was to establish a moderated chain reaction. And so what they did there at Chicago was they used a moderator. And in some cases, a moderator can be water that is mostly composed of a heavy form of water made of H2O, where the hydrogen actually has a neutron attached, heavy water. Normally, hydrogen is just a proton and an electron, and that's it. But by the way, if you have two of those neutrons, that's tritium. That's what they actually use to fuse in hydrogen. Anyway, this gentleman, Marvin Wilkening, had worked directly with Fermi. Now, the moderator that they used in the Chicago pile was graphite. And what is graphite on the atomic level? It's like a hall of mirrors, but it's also kind of like a series of orderly hogshoes, keeping the neutrons moving in clear paths so that they will more likely strike another large atom and produce some more neutrons. That's a simplified version. It's both a reflector, it's a way to slow down the neutrons so that they don't just go whizzing past all the other atoms. And it worked. Well, Marvin Wilkening's job was to take blocks of graphite and run them over a Sears jointer. And then he would drill little pockets in them and put in these little nodules of enriched uranium that were developed by a metallurgist, Spedding. So they called them Spedding's eggs. And they would put these into these bricks of carbon, of pure carbon, pure graphite, and then they would stack them up. And they started off kind of predicting that it was going to be a sphere kind of by this size, and then they, by the time it actually got up to where it was producing a reaction, it was more like a sort of an onion shape on the inside. And it was a bunch of little beads all suspended inside of a big pile of graphite. Anyway, those are a couple of people going that, but that is not the strangest thing that happened. And here's kind of the weird punchline of the whole thing. Mindful of these two movies this last summer, right? The Barbie movie and the Oppenheimer movie, which has been referred to as Barbenheimer. That day, at the Trinity site, on the 50th anniversary of that test that was successful, there was a guy, probably a lot like myself, a kind of an artist, who was fascinated with these things as well. But he was engaged in a kind of almost a kind of a creative, kind of a performance action. And he was, get a load of this, and this is it, walking around the Trinity site at the 50th anniversary of the Trinity test, holding a miniature 1950s convertible car, and in it were a Barbie and Ken. Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Okay, anyone have any questions for Matt? Got one over there.
This is not so much about your particular trip, but having made the trip and having read about the bomb, I've always personally wondered how people who are working on it could somehow divorce themselves from the idea of the destruction it would eventually cause. Do you just get so excited about the science? Is it like the project for patriotism? Can you speak a little bit about how they could kind of suspend that?
Yeah, that's been the topic of some conversation with friends lately, and yeah, a lot of the people